Welcome to this channel on magnetic energy technology, principles, and applications. This video is on magnetic energy and levitation and force fields. This is very unconventional information, so please set your expectations accordingly. Even though there's been experiments and brilliant minds over the years who have sacrificed their lives to validate this data and have had great experimental results, this is still unconventional for now. And that's okay. This type of levitation I'm talking about has nothing to do with repel fields. And for future work on the magnetic energy technology for engineers, do not try to solve problems with a repel-repel reaction. Always try to look for either an attract-attract or an attract-release type of mechanism or reaction or action, however you want to describe that. The repel thing, which is all over the internet, and magnets levitating, and then you have the maglev trains, you have all this stuff about repelling. It is an unbalanced and a very inefficient use of etheric energy, of magnetic energy forces. It's extremely limiting. So we always try to think in terms of how can I have an attract or an attract release do the same work that the repel field's doing. And so part of that then comes into this principle of combining forces or combining fields. And in the magnetic energy model, we are always combining fields of different pulse rates, fields of different polarities, and that's because fields, and this is exemplified in nature so perfectly, the magnetic fields love to be combined in the model that we're talking about. They love it. And I'm going to get into the exact details on how that actually works. So in the levitation part of this video, what I'm really talking about is like the frictionless motion through a medium. And so the medium could be water, it could be our atmosphere, or it could even be space. But it's the frictionless motion and what's required to do that, and what's required from a magnetic energy point of view. These are just some of the dynamics I'm going to touch on in this video on how to make that possible and how this really works. And look, when you're thinking about how objects can levitate, and I'm talking about true levitation here, levitation that where the object itself is weightless, but the amount of weight on that object or that body or that ship or that vehicle is essentially unlimited. So, you can have tons and tons of weight. This isn't some ridiculous electrostatic response or anything like that. This is an etheric magnetic energy model that has a tremendous amount of power without force. So there's nothing being forced here. We are using attract principles. So let's talk about levitation in our atmosphere, just for example. Now, a lot of people have always thought, well, we want something that's anti-gravity, or they'll talk about wanting something that just simply goes up. But the problem with that is, if you have any experience in this area, you know that just to have that one field that's essentially attracting you upward isn't that great, because there is no control over that. And so that's like one field that doesn't have a balancing counterpart. Now, gravity in the magnetic energy model is not just simply a function of mass. There are magnetic energy fields, pulsing fields, that work together. And like on our planet, for example, there's always two fields. There's the field coming from the upper ionosphere inward, and then the field that's pulling essentially from the planet to inside of the planet. And so those two fields both contain magnetic energy pulse rates that need to be interacted with in order to produce really excellent controlled levitation. Now the magnetic energy pulse rates have to be relatively neutral. And so when you look in like the devices, we talk all about generating neutral magnetic pulses, and in the rudimentary model of that, you can have that controlled by the speed, the RPMs, the revolutions of something. You can control it by the type of coils that you have and how fast they release those pulses, the strength of the magnets. So there's a variety of factors that can contribute to that. But as scientists and engineers really explore this energy, they'll end up using like crystal type of technology and there's a whole bunch of different ways to generate the correct pulse rates, the pulsing fields. So one relatively neutral magnetic energy field will be pulsing and essentially grabbing onto the downward pulse of the gravity. And then the other field will counteract that and grab onto the pulse that's the lower pulse, if you will. And so what happens then is you have everything on a particular ship. Like if you have, just for simplicity's sake, if you have a field generation on the bottom of a vehicle and then one on the top of the vehicle, and they have vortices that are counter-rotating and producing magnetic pulsing fields, one is going, the top one's going through the ship and the other one's going up. Those columns of energy will interact, and so you'll have this area in between them when they're interacting that essentially becomes neutral, and that field will not move. It is tightly gripped onto the gravitational pulses that are coming down, that are coming through those fields. It tightly grips on those, so it won't move up and it won't move down. And it's so critical to have both of those. The key to this is balancing your pulse modulation. So when you balance the pulse modulation, you can achieve that perfect stasis of harmony right there. Now, as you adjust it either way, then the ship will be attracted up or the ship will be attracted down. And you'd say, well, why do we need it attracted down? We can just simply let gravity do its job. There's a lot of problems with that, though. You want a very controlled descent, especially because you always want the occupants in this vehicle surrounded by both pulsing fields. That way it keeps them weightless and it keeps them free of G-force. Because when this type of ship and this type of vehicle, when it goes up, and even if it's just an experimental disc in a lab, when it goes up at an extraordinary velocity, and it will rip through any structure that you have. And so it's very important that you have balancing fields that counteract each other and they work together. They're not opposing, they're working together, and they produce the toroidal pulsing field around whatever it is that vehicle is. Now that's kind of the simple way of explaining this, but you can also do it in arrays. So those fields can come from essentially the same point of origin, one being inside the other, and then they produce the field that is an array around them so that you can have any shape of vehicle that you want. And you could simply have then an array on the bottom because the fields will extend through the top. Now, so as you change that field, as you change the pulse modulation between those fields, you can determine the height of that particular object. So it could be a foot off the ground, it could be 1,000 feet off the ground. But wherever it is, it'll lock into those energy fields and it'll be 100% stable in that position. Now the same thing works with lateral motion. So you can have those arrays or those fields on the sides of the ship, and then it does the same thing. One is essentially attracting to an etheric energy, to an etheric flow, and the other one is not repelling it, but it's simply attracting to the converse of that etheric flow. So as they work together, you can produce incredibly fast lateral motion. Now the key to this is, and I know this sounds simple, but it's this idea of think of the etheric flow. So if you're an engineer and you're developing a ship that is going to work on these principles, you've got to think in terms of the etheric field flow, okay? Because that's what you're tapping your pulse modulation fields into, is the etheric flow. And why is that so important? It's important because it changes. And so you've got to tap your mechanism, your machinery have to tune in. If you're on a different planet or a different body, that flow is different. The etheric field flow is so critical. That's how you're going to get levitation. That's how you're going to produce motion. And then we move into the force field aspect of that. And that's where we get into having frictionless motion in a medium. So the force fields are slightly different because what we're doing is we're targeting molecular structures. We're targeting the etheric flow in and out of those molecular structures. So that could be the molecular structures of the atmosphere. It could literally be larger solid objects. Now, if you've watched other videos, you know I've talked about like formulation, reformulation, and deformulation of matter. And when we do that, we're literally targeting the molecular structures because we want to know, as far as like any piece of matter is concerned, what the actual molecular structures are to duplicate, to reformulate, deformulate, so we can break them down, like if they're trash, or we can duplicate them, or we can literally formulate them out of ether. So we're targeting molecular structures. But when you're thinking about force field, magnetic pulsing fields that are in modulation with each other, you do not target the molecular structures. And why is that? Because what would happen is your ship would bust through everything and it would destroy everything in its path. And so what we do is we target the etheric flow of those molecular structures so that everything safely moves around the ship, and it essentially then becomes frictionless. Now, the force field modulation is the same type of thing, whereas as you're balancing those fields, the force field can be right up against the ship, or it could be 10 or 20 feet out, or any combination therein. Not only that, but the force field modulation pulses can actually target very specific things. So you might want to say, for example, block certain types of radiation, especially as you're moving through space, certain types of harmful radiation or certain types of EMFs or whatever it is. So it's not necessarily just about objects. It could be all kinds of energy fields that you need to be protected from. And so you may have a variety of essentially magnetic force fields that are surrounding your vehicle that all target different things, and they could even be at different distances out from that field. So when you have those relatively neutral pulsing magnetic fields that are counterbalancing each other, the force field combined with what you could call the levitation fields or the anti-gravitic fields, now you have something that can move through a medium that in a frictionless state, and that allows for really all kinds of amazing things, not just in terms of transportation, but if you think about those principles and how they could apply to various industries, even sports, think about the suit, okay? You could have a suit that has pulse modulation on it, that are bouncing pulse modulation, neutral magnetic fields, that not only that you could control the weightlessness of that suit, you could control the force field around that suit. So in terms of like athletics or sports or anything, it could completely transform that entire industry. Not to mention, it's pretty handy in space exploration or going to other planets so that you can adjust your force field and adjust your anti-gravitic field around that to something that you're comfortable with. So if there's too much gravity or too little gravity on that planet, if the fields are too strong, you adjust your suit accordingly so you're not subject to anything that's those fields that are happening on other planet. You're able to modulate those and control those. And so I just wanted to try to obviously there's no way I can give too much detail on this because there's tremendous implications to this technology. What I want to get out there are some of the dynamics and how this stuff works in the magnetic energy model and what we can expect to see coming as we go through these transitions that we're about to enter into in the next few years. And now before I end this video, I have to play this YouTube game. So if you have not subscribed, please subscribe to this channel. I'm going to be coming up with other videos and especially updates on what's happening with Earth and Earth changes and pole shift and that kind of thing. So you might want that information. If you find that you even liked this video a tiny bit, please click on the like thing and then take 10 seconds to just send in a comment or a question so that I can continue dialoguing with you on this topic. I fly through these topics so fast and I want to make them try to get your brain thinking, get you interested, but I also am willing to keep the dialogue going in the comment section. So please submit comments and questions and share these videos with other people so we can start to get this message out there, because at some point these videos could become quite important And if the magnetic energy stuff gets out there and we have some evolution or progress going with this technology, some people may need to look at some of these videos to help them developing the technology in the correct manner and not doing ridiculous things like trying to figure out how to make a repel field work and bouncing around and bobbling around in some vehicle, 3 feet off the ground trying to repel everything. Because that is a possibility, but I'm telling you right now, it's a terrible idea. You've got to think in terms of attract fields, attracting up, attracting down, and then pulse modulation and balancing those fields. That's the correct way to do it. And so with that, I will see you next time.